Welcome to the Small Business Success Tips podcast with me, your host, Neil McDonnell. I've dedicated myself to your success in federal government contracting and host these podcast episodes as a way to provide key information and tips that'll help small businesses like yours learn how to more effectively sell your services to federal buyers. Government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process. In each episode, our guest shares their knowledge and experience with you, helping you learn a bit more about the process. While they will have different titles, their common goal is to help the federal government benefit from what small businesses offer. Each guest donates their time because they realize not everyone has the budget or time to meet them in person, and we absolutely thank them for that. Our guest today is Jenny Clark, the CEO of Solvability out of Florida, but serving customers all across the country. Jenny has over 30 years of experience in federal government contract market, and she focuses on the financial strategies to make small businesses more competitive. She hosts Florida's annual GovCon Summit and is a frequent contributor to the GovCon industry as an author, speaker, and coach. I've asked Jenny to join us today to share insight on how you can price more competitively and win more contracts, so you can improve profits, obviously, substantially. Guy Kawasaki of Apple Computer fame said that we all should be impatient for profit and patient for growth. I'm excited to have Jenny here because she can help us with both of those. Welcome, Jenny, and thank you for joining us today. As you know, I like to start each episode off with the same question to help listeners know a bit more about you. From a very high level, what do you do and what do you like about what you do?
Well, Neil, what I do in working with small businesses and federal contracting is show them the ropes, what they need to know from a financial or business system standpoint about government contracting. Federal contracting is different from being in a commercial business because you've got lots more rules to follow, and you're really having to figure out not how you sell to the government, but how you make it possible for them to buy from you. So my goal is always to help those small businesses along, guide them in the process so that they can profit and grow.
Is that the part you like best about it, Jenny, is the seeing the successes with your customers and clients?
Absolutely, Neil. What I like to be able to see is somebody that I've worked with for a little while. We had a checklist that we were working through. They followed most of my advice, and they call me up and say, guess what, Jenny? We just won that contract. It makes me feel like the communities that you and I are creating by serving these customers are benefiting from the learning that they're sharing with us and with each other.
No, that's cool. Yeah, and you and I have talked multiple times, and that's a passion I think we both share, is helping others. So I'm pretty excited about it. You've been in the industry in this role a lot longer than me, but I'm so excited about it, and I appreciate you being here. So I wanted to talk about, some of the things that you're an expert on and you really help your customers with. I appreciate you being here today and sharing that, because it's an area that I haven't really done in these podcasts. Generally, I talk from a small business specialist or contracting officer's perspective of how people can succeed. But I know that your two main areas you help are the back end systems for companies and pricing. And so I want to start just with pricing for a second, because some of the folks listening to this are going to be very experienced multi-million-dollar firms already in the government contracting space, and some are fairly new to the whole GovCon world. How can you introduce us to pricing, right, as it relates to federal government contracting? What is pricing?
Absolutely, Neil. So pricing is, what are you going to charge your government customer? Your government customer is going to expect you to be in a certain price range. You're like, well, how do I know what that's going to be? Do I just guess at this? Most of the small businesses that I work with are really trying to sell services. And so just like an attorney prices by the hour or a CPA firm prices by the hour, most of these small businesses start off by saying, I just started a small business and I want to get a project where I get paid for 1,000 hours worth of work on a project, but how do I know how much to charge? So the first question I always have to ask them is, how much do you think you should pay yourself? And they'll normally say something around, let's say $80,000 a year is what I think I'm worth on the market. That's $40 an hour, roughly. And what I remind them is, on top of what you pay yourself, you've got operating expenses of the company. You got payroll taxes. Maybe you want to pay yourself some health insurance. Maybe you have office rent. Maybe you've got legal costs and bank fees and tax returns to prepare. Those costs you have to include in your pricing. So when I tell people, if you feel like you're picking a number out of the middle of the air, I would probably take that $40 an hour and say, I've got to charge between $60 and $80 an hour in order to cover my cost and make profit. And of course, as the company gets larger, you start applying more science. But I typically would say you'd either take your pay rate and double it or a little bit less than that.
No, that makes sense. I tend to always start off with, let's say $100 an hour is $200 or $200,000 a year for easy math, just doubling it. But let me pick apart a little bit about what you said there, because you were talking about, basically the salary I would want to pay myself, and then these other expenses that were out there. Are these what you're talking about when people talk about direct costs and indirect costs?
You're going to win the prize today, Neil. Direct and indirect cost is exactly what it is. Direct cost is the cost of my personal labor, or if I have an employee that's doing the work for me, they're dedicated to delivering that contract. That's their full-time job that they do. Those are direct costs. Another example of a direct cost would be if your client said, hey, we need you to go to a meeting in Washington, and we're going to pay for that for you to attend this meeting, and you've got your airline ticket, your hotel, and your car rental, and your per diem. Those are also called direct cost. Some people call them billable cost. So direct costs are the cost of delivering the service, but indirect costs are the things that you have to be able to do that. Like, I've got to be able to bill for that cost. I have to have a business license. Those are all the indirect costs, and there's so many of them. Support cost.
And just picking that apart a little bit, and obviously I'm going to win a prize on anything I do a good job preparing for, but this, that I really like to help business owners who are at various levels of experience, and so that I want to drive into some of these a little bit more. But just clarifying the direct cost when we talk about an employee, that's related costs are not just my salary, but perhaps my health insurance or something like that. And I'm going to ask you, is that correct? And then would the cost of my office space, for example, if I had office in Houston and Dallas, is that considered direct cost or is that indirect cost?
That is a great example, Neil. The rent space that you have could benefit multiple contracts. So it's not dedicated to one contract. So a perfect example of an indirect cost is your office expenses and your rent, utilities, all of those costs, because you have to have that to operate the business. So some people call those operating costs. Some people call them overhead costs. It's really what you have to spend before a dime worth of revenue comes into the company.
Okay, no, that makes total sense. And just that way you said it too, is that this cost would benefit multiple contracts. So then it from a high level, it just can't be a direct. And I think I want to push in a little bit on that too, because you have a tool on your website I was checking out, and I'd love for you to explain it a little bit more. But I've heard things like you just said, overhead. I've heard wrap rate and your multiplier. People say, what's your multiplier? I guess first, could you talk a little bit about what are the ways I would hear people talking about direct and indirect, similar to like multiplier? And then how does that fit into this wrap rate calculator you have?
Neil, that's an excellent question. A few minutes ago when we were talking about how do you set your rate, and I gave an example of I'm paying myself $40 an hour, so I'm going to bill twice that, or $80 an hour, and you use the same thing. I'm paying myself $100,000 a year. I need to have $200,000 worth of revenue. That would be a multiplier of 2, because you're just taking what you're paying yourself and doubling it. Well, that's what a multiplier does. All kinds of industries use multipliers to figure out how to cover all their costs. The example I like to give is the difference between somebody that is working in a jewelry store and they've got the direct cost is the cost of the diamond and the ring itself. And the indirect cost is, well, they've got a sales staff, they've got security, they've got all those pretty cases. All of those things are called overhead or support costs, because what you're selling is the direct cost. So what a multiplier or a wrap rate does, and in government contracting, people call it different things, so it's very confusing. But what you typically would say is the wrap rate is what you're going to bill your customer at. So $40 an hour is what I'm paying myself. My wrap rate is $80 an hour. My billing rate is $80 an hour, because in that $80 an hour, I cover my cost of my labor, plus my payroll taxes, plus legal fees, plus all those other costs. So it's really like a markup. In the jewelry industry that I was just talking about, a markup on a diamond ring is probably 5 times the cost of that ring. In government contracting, if you charge 5 times that $40 an hour, you wouldn't win any contracts. And that's why it's so important to understand not only how the math works, but what the market will bear.
No, that's a good point. And just very quickly, if I restate it in a different set of words that we've been using also, but $40 is my basically $40 is my salary, and I'm multiplying it by 2, so I have a multiplier of 2, and then that would be my wrap rate. $80 would be my wrap rate.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so is there, and I've heard people throw these cautions out there, so I might as well just throw it out since you and I are diving into some details, but neither of us are lawyers or CPAs. We're not giving you financial advice. That's the whole reason you talk to people. We're giving you experience advice. And then we tell you to go find your pros. So on the one of the things we talked about, though, is profit. And I always see small businesses being confused about this. I see bigger businesses being a little confused about this. What's the allowable profit? One allowable profit margin or allowable profit to a company is based on what the market accepts, right? If the market doesn't pay you, you're not making profit. But are there limits in the FAR or anywhere else that you know of that cap how much profit I can make on that $40?
As you said, it's based on the market. And what I would tell people is in federal contracting, the typical profit percentage that people are using could be anywhere from 5 to 15%. Sometimes they'll get up as high as 20, but you'd only get that if you had something that was really unique and differentiated and you're the only person that can do it. But whenever people say, well, I'm getting into government contracting because I'm going to make so much money, I always like them to step back for a minute, and I'll say, profit margins in federal contracting are probably more like 5 to 12%. And they're going, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. You mean I might be better off doing commercial work? Possibly.
Well, yeah, and that's a whole nother podcast for us, right, Jenny? Is that I think the security of the federal outweighs the higher profit margin, but I totally see what you're saying. So that's perfect. And that I haven't heard that before, so it's fun for me even just to hear that 5 to 15% range. Let me bring it back though to the wrap rate calculator, because you have that on your website. You offer it as I think a free service to people who visit your website. Can you tell me more about that? Because it looked cool, and I want you to be able to share that.
So what the wrap rate calculator does is I've created this whole set of little spreadsheet tools that I've used all the time over my career. And once you learn how to use them, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like the secret decoder ring I've been looking for. So one of the things that is a real challenge for small businesses in federal contracting once they start competing for contracts is, unlike a commercial company, you could be asked to back up how you came up with that price. So it's not enough to say, I'm paying myself 40, so I'm going to charge you 80. The government will actually, in many cases, come back and say, we're going to send an auditor to find out how you came up with that price, and we expect you to be able to explain it. What the wrap rate calculator does is really using a budget or what your actual costs are for your profit and loss for the year, lets you figure out what your costs are. An example of that would be if I was running a training company, I've got to develop a lot of the training materials. So my cost might be higher than somebody that's just hiring somebody to operate the truck in a warehouse. But the wrap rate calculator takes into account, here's how much you should expect to spend for payroll taxes, leave like vacation, sick, and holiday, and group benefits like the company cost of health insurance, life insurance, and so forth. That's called fringe benefit. The next element of cost is usually called overhead, and that's office space, plus anything you have to do to support your technical workforce. It's going to be more expensive if you have to spend a lot of money on recruiting, or if you've got a lot of training or credentialing you have to do. And the third element of the wrap rate is your corporate expense. And that's the cost of running the corporation itself, the accounting department, human resources, the company executives. When you're small, you're like, wait a minute, I'm working out of my home. I've only got this. I don't pay an attorney because we don't have any revenue. Your wrap rate's going to be low. You can bid low. But if you ever want to grow, you've got to be thinking about, how am I ever going to have any benefits and health insurance unless I start bidding it into my cost? And so what the wrap rate calculator does is lets you create a budget for what I would call your profit and loss or income statement, and the relationship of those costs to what you're delivering. The number one thing that we're doing in government contracting, just like any other industry, is you want to get to a certain, what I call an economy of scale with your company. When it's just one person, you can't duplicate yourself. You're not making much money. When you start building into your company that you've got a full-time staff, you've got to have enough work coming in to pay for that full-time staff. And I think that's really what we were talking about when you said people go after government contracts because of the long-term stability. And you're absolutely right about that, Neil. What we do with the wrap rate calculator is kind of help you figure out how you would scale that business to go from 1 employee to 10 to 50, 50 to 100.
No, that's perfect. And I hope you're drinking water, because as I'm listening to you, I'm getting so excited about talking to somebody in this space. Like, I'm very good in sales and marketing, for example. That's my swim lane. And in here, I'm like, oh, I can pick your brain. I forget that I'm doing a podcast, and I'm like, oh, I got to ask Jenny this. And so stay hydrated, because I want to ask you another series of questions. But one thing I mentioned to you earlier that I wanted to just ask about, when we're going after opportunities out there and we're looking at RFPs, et cetera, requests for proposals, we see sometimes terms like DCAA compliant or DCAA audited. And I don't really care about audited at the moment, because that's a much more mature step forward. But when we hear DCAA compliant, first, can you just explain briefly what that is? And then do you have any tips for us on how we might look at preparing ourselves to get to DCAA compliant? If you think about compliance being phase 2, phase 1 is just, getting into the game. Does that make sense?
Neil, you do make sense with that question. What you're talking about when you say DCAA compliance is Defense Contract Audit Agency. So the government has set up rules for government contracting, and most people look to the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR. Inside the FAR, there are certain rules related to what they call cost principles. And so as a small business in government contracting, or a large business like a Boeing or a Raytheon, everybody's got to follow the same kind of rules. And so that's part of the reason we started off with this definition of direct versus indirect, because the first thing that you want to be establishing as a small business in federal contracting is a structure of your accounting system and your reporting. That's one of the big costs for a federal contractor as well, because you either have to learn it yourself, or you should go to somebody that understands it. And one of the most expensive mistakes that I see small businesses in federal contracting make is thinking that they can just use their brother-in-law as their CPA and get what they need. This Defense Contract Audit Agency compliance is a very specialized area, and you really need to go with somebody that knows how to do it. it's a structured reporting system. Just like if you were in the manufacturing business, you'd have a structure to the way your costs are reported. Or if you were making slushies, it's a different one. Or if you're doing construction, or different businesses have different structures, government contracting has a structure. So when you start to bid contracts and you're a subcontractor under a prime contract, even in the proposal stage, that big company is going to come to you and they're going to send you something called reps and certs. And they're going to ask you, do you have a DCAA compliance system? And you're going to go, I don't know. Where would you look for that information? I'm going to tell you where. If you go to DCAA.mil, that's the Defense Contract Audit Agency. That's where to start. And there's actually, you have to dig around for a little bit, but there's something called Information for Contractors. And it's a link you can download the document on what it is. And it explains a lot of what we're talking. But I think the main thing that we're saying is everything in government contracting has its own set of rules, doesn't it, Neil?
Yeah, it does. And it's funny because I keep saying government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process. And if you go to DCAA.mil, you'll find part of the process being defined for you by the government themselves. And then just clarified by you, Jenny. It's so cool listening to you because I'm like, man, I wish I knew a lot of this stuff before, or I interacted with people like you when I was running my own businesses, because there's a lot of things I struggled on. But if I had connected with somebody like you, I would have been able to really move forward much more prepared, which I'm hoping a lot of people will do. I mentioned at the end of this that we'll put your contact information into the post, but I hope people reach out. I do like the one thing that you're like one major takeaway that I'm putting here as it relates to my brother-in-law, right, is that when you're in government contracting, you really do want to find a CPA and a lawyer who are experienced in the GovCon space because they understand the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is basically the rules for all this. So that was a really good tip. And it leads me in, Jenny, to something I was going to ask you about. When you talk about rates and pricing, direct costs, indirect costs, what have you seen over the years of your experience that maybe you'd advise us to watch out for? You know, like one or two major mistakes we make, like, for example, the one you said on hiring the wrong person for a CPA. Do you have a couple other tips of things for us to avoid as we move forward?
I think the main tip that I would say is if you're going to be in federal contracting, you need to be very much immersed in it, surrounding yourself with other people that are very involved in government contracting. It's not something you can really dabble in. And the companies that I work with that have been successful, and I should tell you that most of the companies I'm working with are doing labor, they're doing services work. And for the most part, people call it butts in seats. And that just means that I'm just a temporary agency happening to supply experienced personnel that meet certain requirements to the federal government. So when you are looking at your company strategy and the kind of work you want to go after, I'm sure that's when you would talk to Neil about what kind of work you're going after. But you really need to become immersed in what your competitors are doing and what's it going to take for you to get there in the same way. I know that, Neil, we talked about one of your top things that you do is help people understand how to decide what markets they're in. And within that market, I would say my top advice is to be talking to other people in that same subset of government contracting and learn a little bit more about what it's taken to get there, because it's a fairly large investment. And I don't see people being successful that are just, okay, I'm just going to try to do this. It's kind of like when you talk to people about selling real estate, it's hard to be a part-time real estate person and make any money, right?
Yeah, you have to really get in there and build that reputation. You know, it's funny. I'm listening to you talk about it, and I keep thinking of different analogies that relate to this. But you know, if you're in the real estate world, you're not dealing across every aspect of the real estate. You're in commercial real estate or residential. You're in single family properties or multifamily properties. You're a broker or you're a listing agent or a buying agent, and people specialize on those. And that's exactly what you were referring to that I recommend people do is lock down that core competency. You can always build a business continuing to grow where your team can handle more of that. But initially, you've got to decide whether you're selling or you're buying and specialized kind of thing. So, hey, we're getting kind of towards the track. I think we got like five minutes or more, a little bit more for the podcast. And I wanted to pull one more tip out of the pricing and then switch over to systems briefly. And then inside of pricing, you alluded to this a little bit about competitors. Do you have tips for us on how we might be able to choose choosing our pricing? One way you mentioned was decide how much I want to get paid. I want to get paid $80,000, so that's $40 an hour. But could we look at our competitors to get ideas of what's kind of market acceptable rates out there?
Neil, what most people do is they find a couple of buddies that are doing something similar and they start having some conversations about how pricing works. Because as we said, it's partly what the market will bear, but it's also depending on the competitive situation. When I said earlier, you take your pay rate times 2, well, that's pretty much the way top end of the scale for small businesses and federal contracting. What I've seen over the course of the last probably 15 years is a real pressure on prices because the federal budget is very tight. And so when it gets competitive on price, everybody's prices go down. And there are some points at which you really shouldn't even bid. So what I would tell people is you need to understand your cost well enough. And probably the least you could bid would be to take that $40 an hour times 1.5. So your multiplier probably needs to be between 1.5, 1.7. Also, it can depend on where the work is. Working in Washington, D.C. is way more expensive than it is in Tampa Bay. You have to take a look at, do you have special costs that you're going to have to incur? Could it be that you've got people that have to climb telephone poles? Your workers' comp expense is going to be high. Your costs are going to be higher. So I think it kind of goes back to what you said about the realtors. What market are you going to be? Who are you going to serve? And take a look at where your skills fit into your interest and where you're located, and really do a lot of talking to other companies. Now, people aren't going to open up and tell you all their pricing, but you can usually find somebody that wants to work with you and they're on your team, and you'll say, I think that price should be $75 an hour, and they'll say, I'm not so sure about that. Then you would know, okay, they probably want me to go down. So it's just a negotiation game. On the other hand, if you say 75 and right away they take that deal, you're going to have to be thinking about maybe you left some money off the table, but you've got to figure that out for yourself. And the only way to do it is to get out there. You can't just read about swimming. You got to jump in the pool.
Right. That's good. I tell people to find, over the course of your efforts, find 5 solid partners, teammates. And these are people who are focused on both companies being successful. You're not focused on any given opportunity or even any given agency. You're finding friends in the industry, and then it allows you to have a lot more candid conversations. And as you move forward, that's my absolute favorite thing to do for any of my customers, is to put people together until you find that right connection and go, good, there. You only need 5 really good friends. You can have a lot of teaming partners at different stages, but having those 5 key people will give you the opportunity to do what Jenny was just talking about. So let me switch over to one of the other things that you really focus on helping your customers. And I just want to touch on it briefly, and then people can reach out to you to get more information. Because just saying this, that's the point of these podcasts from my perspective, is for me to introduce listeners to Jenny so that if pricing, for example, or systems are a question for you and you're at that stage and you want to move forward, well, now you've got somebody you basically have just interviewed and see that she and her firm are experts at this. And you go, oh, let me go out there and talk to her. So, Jenny, one of the other things you were telling me that is a specialty of yours is systems. Can you just briefly talk about what do you mean when you talk about those back-end systems that help companies operate?
What you're looking for as a federal contractor is you've got to be DCAA compliant. Defense Contract Agency compliant. And one of the things that people may not know is when you start off doing work for the federal government and you're billing the government by the hour, they're going to expect your employees to fill out a timesheet every day, and it'll identify their charge numbers so that you can bill according to that. You can't just guess, and you can't just make it up. And so you have to have very specific systems to be able to do this. Most companies that I work with will start off with QuickBooks, and I tell them to use QuickBooks desktop version, not the online version, because of the complexity you're going to need to add in federal contracting. What I run into is if companies don't want to spend money on systems, they really shouldn't be in government contracting because there's so much reporting that is required. You're looking for systems that are integrated, because otherwise, if you're doing a paper timesheet and you're typing the information in to do your payroll, and then you type the information in someplace else to do a billing, you're not going to have accurate information, and you're going to spend all kinds of time doing clerical activity. You also need to be, as a federal contractor, able to scale your business. And if you think about it, just like you're setting up this podcast and you came up with, here's my script and here's what I want to do, as a federal contractor, you've got to have a plan for, oh my gosh, we won that contract and we're going to be a sub to a large company, and they're going to expect us to be able to send them an invoice probably the day after the end of the month, and they want it to be right. I've got to be able to turn that around quickly. What systems will I need? So I tell people to start with QuickBooks Desktop. If people say, can I use Peachtree? Can I do something like that? I might say, not if you want to work with me, because I just don't like to use things that are not standard. And that QuickBooks is the number one. So the second thing is you might have to buy some timesheet software that goes with that. You've got to be thinking about what your payroll is going to be. Intuit does have a payroll system, and I recommend that people do that. People are always calling me up and saying, I want to use such and such payroll. It's going to do all this whiz-bang stuff. Well, if it doesn't tie into your other systems, it doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to get anything. And you can spend so much money on systems. You really want to have a plan for how you're going to do it and how you're going to grow, because as you're successful, you're going to outgrow a QuickBooks system, and you're going to need to go to a Uninet or a Deltek or a Jamis or different things, and that takes a lot of expertise. I'm always amazed when people say, can you help me find a DCAA compliant bookkeeper? Because they don't exist. It's a very unique accounting method, and you really need to have people that understand what they're doing. Does that answer your question, Neil?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It absolutely does. And for me, I just want to make sure the audience understands that there's these phases. And Jenny and I have talked about this, where I really try to help people in phase one, getting into the government contracting world and really get traction, get your initial revenue, where solvability really focuses on the second stage federal contractors. You might think of them as 10 to 100 employees or $2 to $10 million. And so these things she's describing go into there. For those of you at the early stage, a spreadsheet's okay in the beginning, but one of the best things is subcontracting with other firms, because you'll find out, and Jenny, I think you might be able to echo this for me as part of our last question here, is that when you work with other companies and you're a subcontractor under them, they will require that you use their system sometimes, which is a great way for you to kind of learn it. Have you experienced that, where you have the primes requiring the subs to use their system?
Absolutely. The primes started doing that many years ago, because what they realized is when the prime signs the contract and they have a subcontractor under there, they're taking responsibility that the subcontractor is capable of doing the reporting that's required. And so when a proposal is being submitted, and this is why those primes, when they're sending out the proposals and they're asking you to fill out all these forms for reps and certs, representations and certifications, they can get themselves into a lot of trouble if you as a subcontractor can't provide what's required. And so they will kind of like set it up so you can use their systems. What they're doing is making it so whether you send them a bill at the end of the month immediately or not, If your employees fill out a timesheet on their system, they can use that information to create the bill that goes to the customer. The customer is looking for instant reporting as much as possible. Nobody really wants to wait 3 weeks to receive a bill to know where they are on anything. Because the government's, and it happens right now, as we come across toward the end of a fiscal year in September, people need to know exactly where they are in the budget, because they either have to finish spending or they have to slow down so they get their budget numbers perfect. Doesn't that happen a lot, Neil?
Yeah, it does. And you're so right about the you can invoice me whenever you want, but I need the compliance numbers right now. I think I highly recommend those of you listening to reach out, connect with Jenny. We'll put down in the notes, the show notes, and the other places we post is how you can get hold of her. But connect with her, especially if you have any early questions of asking about what are some of these systems, because partly you learn about them and you begin to figure out maybe how she and her firm might help, but also it helps you understand what you might reach out to your teaming partners and say, hey, can you tell me more about how you do this, how you do that? That's how we all learn, is going forward. So we're kind of tight on time here. So thank you very much, Jenny. I know I speak for our listeners when I say thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. I love it because even I got great tips out of this. So thanks for that. I mentioned this already. We're going to have your contact information and any links that you think will be helpful to the folks and that you talked about today. We'll put those in the show notes, including the DCAA Mill site. But can you let our listeners know how can they best reach you or your team if they want to learn more?
The best place to find me is to go out on LinkedIn. I'm listed as Jenny W. Clark, Solvability. I've got a lot of things that I post out there and the articles. I've got podcasts on my website, but I really think the easiest way to find me and for me to chat with you is on LinkedIn. So connect with me over there. Let me know that you heard about me from Neil's podcast, and I'd be glad to send you in the right direction on maybe the next steps that you need to take. And the investment that your listeners are making in learning about government contracting, Neil, is so important. So thanks for having me.
Appreciate that. Okay, so as we wrap up this episode, I wanted to remind all of you listening of a few things. First, if you find this information valuable and think others would, please share a note about us on LinkedIn or one of the other social media platforms. Definitely give us a thumbs up where you can. Second, click the subscribe button for this podcast to make sure you're notified when new episodes are released. I'm your host, Neil McDonnell. I thank you for listening to this episode and hope you'll join us again for other episodes. Remember, government contracting, it's not a secret, it's just a process.